All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're actually going to go with Tafseer al-Qurtubi. So yesterday we went in some details about, let's see, about قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا, and we went in details in regards to this ayah. So basically, this is the ayah right there, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ. And of course, we went in details because the scholars had differences of opinions on the timing for the revelation of this ayah. And because of that, they then disputed whether the things that were mentioned here, so we're talking about the carry-ons, we're talking about the blood, we're talking about pork or swine, and whether what is haram in consumption was exclusive to these that were mentioned in this ayah, or whether this ayah was revealed in the early times of Islam, and therefore what is haram in consumption is not exclusive to what was mentioned here, because that was in the early stages of Islam, and it isn't until later that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned other animals or other descriptions of other animals that we are not allowed to eat, whether we're speaking about carnivores or whether we're talking about mules, donkeys, all these different things that we had talked about yesterday. So we're not going to go in details with that one, but I'm going to get to point number 2. There are 4 different points that al-Qurtubi wanted to talk about in regards to this ayah. So he then talks about the word muharrama, which is right there, just this word alone. And then let's see what al-Qurtubi wanted to say. He said, قال ابن عطية لفظة التحريم إذا وردت على لسان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فإنها صالحة أن تنتهي بالشيء المذكور إلى غاية الحظر والمنع، وصالحة بحسب اللغة أن تقف دون الغاية في حيز الكراهة ونحوها. Let me just explain this one. So when he quoted Ibn Atiyah, who's Ibn Atiyah? So Ibn Atiyah had Muharrar al-Wajiz, and basically his tafsir, al-Muharrar al-Wajiz. Here we go. There's that quote right there, and basically telling you exactly where it is. Okay, so Ibn Atiyah was a scholar from Al-Andalus, but his tafsir was one of a kind tafsir. His tafsir is almost in, give or take, 15 volumes. But his tafsir really goes deep in the language and also goes deep in al-ma'thur. So he would pretty much use the same type of method that al-Tabari would use, which is going back to the text in order to make sure that he is not making his own interpretation, but it is backed up by evidence. This is extremely important. So Tafsir ibn Atiyah is actually one of the most important tafsir. Let's see what quote he basically uses, or at least takes from Ibn Atiyah in regards to this. Let's see. He said, in regards to the word of tahrim, so we're talking about the definition of tahrim, or something that is haram. What is the definition, and how do we understand when something is haram? What is and what defines as haram? He said, if it is mentioned on the words, in other words, whether we're speaking about Quran or whether we're talking about Sunnah, then this is to mean that anything that this is referring to, that it would basically lead to an explanation reaching to the highest level of making something impermissible or not acceptable. So al-hadr, making it prohibited. Okay, and he says وصالحة بحسب اللغة أن تقف دون الغاية في حيز الكراهة. And plus, now this is extremely important because remember, this is usul al-fiqh. Let me explain just a little bit about the difference between fiqh and usul al-fiqh. Fiqh is to study, or let me start with usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh basically studies the references that we would use or go back to, and the person that studies usul al-fiqh would say, okay, well, we would use and we would go back to the Quran, we would go back to the hadith, and there are different types of hadith because there's an authentic hadith, there is a hadith da'if. How much do we depend on hadith that are not authentic? What about these different 69 different kinds of hadith da'ifa? How do we understand that? How do we understand the words themselves? Like if I were to have an imperative clause, if I were to have an imperative verb right there, how do we understand this? How do I use this to derive a certain ruling? So the usul al-fiqh science basically comes as, think of it as the pathology. Think of it as the pathology in the main science of pathology, biology, studying anatomy, all these different things. And then the faqih would make use of this science and say, okay, well, based on what I understand from this whole fiqh, this whole basis, then this is how I need to apply to derive the rulings. So faqihs or fuqaha, they actually depend on usul al-fiqh as a reference and as basically the basis in how they research to derive a fatwa. So the faqih derives the fatwa, and they're basically the people that you can consider them on ground, and the usul al-fiqh is basically in the back end. Okay, so just like pathologists, you don't really see the pathologists because they're actually working in labs, but they're the ones to probably take the specimen from the doctors that basically took the specimen. And then the pathologist would basically see the specimen or see whatever they were supposed to see under the microscope, and then say, okay, well, this is what I saw, and this is what this disease is. So the pathologist is working at the back end, and the person that is working, dealing with people, probably diagnosing, or perhaps maybe prescribing medications, all of those are the ones dealing with people. Those are the ones dealing with people. Those are the ones that are pretty much, you can consider them like within the facility, within, let's say, face-to-face with the patients themselves. That's the same thing. A faqih recognizes the problems because they deal with people. They deal with the problems. They recognize the challenges, and then they go back to the resources that the usul al-fiqh specialist basically told them how to make use of it, how to understand it based on lugha arabiya, based on perhaps we're talking about the references and the level of authenticity of the references and so forth. So that's why we need usul al-fiqh and we need al-fiqh. So when we talk about al-tahrim right there and what that means, this is within the area of usul al-fiqh. So what did he want to say? He said, well, when we speak about a sentence or we have any quotation that basically ends with telling me that these matters are, after telling me that it was haram, or at least telling me that this is prohibited, then in that situation, we have to understand that it would basically mean prohibited, and therefore it would be a sin to trespass. Okay, now, the other thing he said, and it also may be inclusive, to include, of course, linguistically, that is, that it may not necessarily reach to the level of haram, meaning the highest, or let's call it the highest point of something being prohibited, but it can be a little lower, meaning that it would be within the area of makruh or hated, or something within that area or within that perimeter. Okay, so just keeping that one in mind, that it's going to be either hated or it's going to be prohibited entirely. But there are times when the sentence itself can actually have a qarina. What is a qarina? A qarina can sometimes be a compound, can sometimes be another clue, can sometimes be another, perhaps maybe a word within the sentence that basically gives me a hint, taking this word or this, let's say this ruling from the highest stage of prohibition, which is haram, to a lower stage, which is makruh, or perhaps even telling me another lower stage, perhaps in an area of mubah. Just like when we talk about, for example, in Surah al-Jumu'ah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, once salah is done, then you have to basically seek rizq. Does that make it that we have to, once salat al-Jumu'ah is done, that we have to go and finish our businesses? Or can we just decide that, you know what, today is my day off? All scholars agreed that it can actually mean that it is within the area of mubah, not necessarily obligatory. Okay, so this is al-qarina. He said, if we have فما اقترنت به قرينة التسليم من الصحابة المتأولين وأجمع عليه الكل منهم لم تضطرب فيه ألفاظ الحديث وجب بالشرع أن يكون تحريمه قد وصل الغاية من الحظر والمنع. Stop right there. What did he say? He said, if we basically have the action, in other words, the understanding of Sahaba, they understood and they had submitted to basically this explanation that, and they all had agreed and unanimously agreed, and there was no dispute whatsoever in any of the matters of hadith, and they all agreed that it was haram and that the wording is giving me nothing but a piece of information that this is actually meaning that this is completely prohibited. So I've got number one, I've got the text. Number two, I have another backup, which is the interpretation that perhaps the hadith are telling me that, but at the same time, I have all the Sahaba unanimously agreeing on a matter that only explains one thing, which is that it was actually prohibited. They didn't disagree on that. There was no differences of opinions, and they all unanimously agreed that it was haram. Then in that situation, وجب بالشرع أن يكون تحريمه قد وصل الغاية من الحظر والمنع. Then in that situation, we would know that it is part of Sharia that this prohibition had actually reached consider it the climax of what would make something as impermissible and prohibited, and therefore it would have no differences of opinions, and that there is no way to reinterpret it any other way. Keep this one in mind, because what we're seeing today is new people rising and basically saying, well, hey, we can have our own interpretation for the hadith, even though we have Sahaba perhaps unanimously agreeing that this was interpreted by the Prophet ﷺ to us in such and such way. Then in that situation, just keeping in mind that once we have this type of interpretation, that even the Sahaba would unanimously agree that it only meant this is how we understood it, then we can't have anybody rise and say, well, I've got my own interpretation, or I have a different explanation to this, because that would actually contradict what the evidence in terms of Quran and Sunnah had basically explained. Let's say, and he said, when that would include things that such as pork, or even carrion, dead animals, or even, of course, blood. And this is what had also led to us to also understand why alcohol, at least, is haram. What is the reason behind khamr being haram? Not necessarily just because it leads you to getting intoxicated, but the main reason is because I have the text for it. The main reason for the rulings on different matters is because I, as a Muslim, believe that this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered me to do or ordered me to leave, and therefore this is the main reason for it. This is how an usuli would look at it. As for the different reasons, now let's look at this one. As for the different reasons of why something is haram, we're going to get to it. Now, the other thing, if we were to have مقترنت به قرينة اضطراب ألفاظ الأحاديث واختلفت الأئمة فيه مع علمهم بالأحاديث كقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع حرام، وقد روي نهي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع، ثم اختلفت الصحابة ومن بعدهم في تحريم ذلك، فجاز لهذه الوجوه لمن ينظر أن يحمل لفظ التحريم على المنع الذي هو الكراهة ونحوها. What is he saying? If I have different ahadith that may be conflicting, okay, in other words, the resources may be conflicting, not only in the data, but even with the interpretation. And I have Sahaba, or I may have scholars perhaps conflicting or disagreeing on different matters, then in that situation, such as this hadith, أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع حرام, eating from any animal, that is a carnivore animal is haram. We would see that scholars basically had differences of opinions. As a matter of fact, even Sahaba had differences of opinions. Then in that situation, we would basically understand that there are differences of opinions, and such a difference of opinion is permissible and is to be taken as basically a considerable difference. Understand this one. Let's understand it clearly. Is any difference of opinion, we're going to say, yes, there are differences of opinions because today perhaps somebody that has an Islamic studies degree, who knows, from SOAS or probably Harvard, basically came up with the idea, and we had some Muslims basically accept this idea, etc. Does that mean that, yeah, there are differences of opinions? No. If we have the scholars, the Sahaba especially, if we have the Sahaba and we later have scholars that agreed on a certain interpretation, then we would say, well, this is what Islam says, and these new interpretations and are not necessarily considerable differences of opinions. Therefore, we're going to disregard the whole idea of what these new people are basically coming up to say. Now, number two, what if we had differences of opinions, even though I had a text? I have a text that's telling me one thing, but then the Sahaba themselves, they basically differed in interpreting this text, and they had differences of opinions on how to understand it and how to apply it. All right, then in that situation, there are differences of opinions that is a considerable difference. Just keep that one in mind. And that's why he said, if we have different Sahaba that had differences of opinions, then in that situation, it would be considerable to say that we can interpret it as haram or interpret it as something that is makruh. All right, keep that one in mind. We can interpret it this way or this way. And of course, the differences of opinions between scholars, we would go back to the considerable scholars. Who's a considerable scholar? The scholars that were endorsed by other scholars, that they are basically qualified to give fatwa, or qualified to be muhaddith, or qualified to be a qari, or be a muqri, or basically be within that field. That's a qualified scholar. He's endorsed by other scholars. Okay, let's continue right there. And then he goes on and says, وَمَا اقْتَرَنَتْ بِهِ قَرِينَةُ التَّأْوِيلِ كَتَحْرِيمِهِ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَسَلَامُ لُحُومَ الْحُمُرِ الْإِنسِيَّةِ فتأول بعض الصحابة الحاضرين ذلك لأنها نجس or نجس وتأول بعضهم ذلك لئلا تفنى حمولة الناس وتأول بعضهم التحريم المحض. Okay, I want you to let's explain this one. So here's the other question that rises. Why are these things haram? How do we understand the reason behind something being haram? Is it because it's impure? Or is it because, we want to make sure that people have the means for transportation, as in, for example, donkey's meat? What is the reason behind it? Now, here's one thing that's very important to understand. There's a difference between hikmah, wisdom, and illah. What's the difference? Al-hikmah is not mundabita. What does that mean? Al-hikmah, we can have different views, we can have different ways of researching things. It's not necessarily limited. It's not limited. Hikam, different wisdoms, you can research that, but just because we have a certain hikmah that we probably, let's look at today. Today, we basically are capable of seeing under the microscope, let's say pig's meat, and we saw that, there are certain parasites in pig's meat, and we basically see, oh, wow, this is interesting. So the wisdom behind pig's meat or pork being haram is because it has these parasites. Let's just assume that they managed to make some kind of a medication to give these pigs to make sure that these parasites don't grow on or in the pig's flesh. Let's just assume this happened. And then under the microscope, we managed to see that indeed we made this medication and this managed to kill all the parasites. And no parasite. Will that transform pig's meat, at least the ones that had been treated with this? Does that make it halal or not? The answer is no, it doesn't make it halal. Well, why not? We just killed the parasite. The parasite is one wisdom you managed to see, but the actual illah, the actual reason why pork is haram is because we have a text to say that it's haram. Let's give another example. Hijab. Is it because it may lead to guys probably flirting with the girls, etc.? That's one hikmah, but that's not exclusive as a illah. That's one hikmah. All right. So having that being said, now the scholars, he's basically explaining here, just because we may have different interpretations, such as the Prophet ﷺ considering that donkey's meat, or at least domestic donkeys, because remember when we said domestic donkeys, basically the Arab used to consider that zebras are wild donkeys. Okay, so we're talking about basically the donkeys that we use, or basically in some countries they would use them as a mean of transporting goods, or probably even mean of transportation and so forth. So he said, some Sahaba, some of the Prophet's companions, they basically explained that the reason, or at least let me not use the reason, but use the wisdom behind that, it is because it's impure. Other scholars, or at least other Sahaba, they said, well, that was in order to make sure that we don't end up slaughtering all these donkeys and then not having the resources to carry their goods, and therefore it basically becomes their life harder. Other scholars, they said, no, we don't necessarily have a reason to it. It's basically just as haram because we have the text for it. Let's see. Now, when we look at all of that, he said, and when we see all of that, it's permissible from the scholars, and this is important, from the scholars to basically look into it and basically consider that the reason for, or at least the hikmah for it, and to why it's haram, they can look at it through ijtihad. What is an ijtihad? Ijtihad is basically deep scrutiny in understanding the reason behind something and then creating a paradigm to understand how these different matters are connected. Let me give you an example. So when we talk about, let's say, meth, we're talking about different kinds of drugs, okay, that street drugs, etc. Are those haram? Someone might say, well, you can't say it's haram because you don't have a text for it. So we'll say, all right, I don't have a text for it, but I do have a text that explains that anything that leads to intoxication or leads to harming the body, then the final ruling on it is that it's going to be haram. He said, kullu mufattirin haram. He said, kullu muskirin haram. And therefore, this text is going to be inclusive to include anything that leads to intoxication or anything that leads to mufattir, anything that leads to getting the person basically ill or weak or basically losing the potentials that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So this is to be done by a mujtahid. Al-mujtahid is basically the scholar that has the potentials, that has the references, that basically has the qualification to research the reference and to understand on ground how we would apply that. This is extremely important. So before I make a fatwa on, for example, CBD, I would have to basically go to the experts and say, okay, well, what does this cause? Weed, what does it do? Can you explain to me? And then if they tell me, well, if taken by this amount, this is going to lead to problems in the brain, problems in the focus, problems in human behavior. And then certainly if we're talking about that, then we're going to be seeing also probably people, coming on the other end, basically, and telling us that it's going to increase crime rate, etc., then, oh, I can see the relationship between the two. Then in that situation, the mujtahid will come in and say, therefore, this is haram. Why? Because sharia maslahatun kulluha. Sharia is all about bringing human interest. In other words, it's all about bringing in what would benefit the society. Okay, now here Qurtubi, look at the beautiful word that he said. He said, وَهَذَا عَقْدٌ حَسَنٌ فِي هَذَا الْبَابِ وَفِي سَبَبِ الْخِلَافِ عَلَى مَا تَقَدَّمَ. And he said, and what we understand from this is that this is the crux of the matter in understanding why there are differences of opinions, or why we would understand the differences of opinions in speaking about different foods, different animals, different things. How do we understand that? There's a difference between talking about some of those different animals or different things that we may call halal, haram, etc. If I have the Sahaba agreeing on an interpretation and agreeing, even if I don't have a hadith, but they said we were ordered not to eat this, that is one. If there's a unanimous agreement, then there would be a final answer, which is that it is haram. Or if I had another hint, taking it from the level of being haram, then it goes to another lower stage, which is makruh. Now, if I had differences of opinions between Sahaba and credible scholars, then in that situation, this would be a considerable area that I may consider that there are considerable differences of opinions. And in that situation, we can have different interpretations, whether it's haram or even makruh, especially that we had discrepancies or even conflicting evidences or conflicting reports in that regards. Number 3, as for describing the reason behind something being haram, they can have different explanations, but we cannot use the wisdom behind something, or at least what we had researched or probably had discovered, to use it as the reason to change the ruling in Islam. So just because we manage to, for example, make some medication to give to, let's say, pigs, and then therefore they're not going to have these parasites, does not change the ruling that pork is haram. Okay, now let's go to the other one. There were some other scholars that basically talked about, wanted to say that one, even though, they didn't necessarily use that as a illa per se, but they used it as a hikmah. Let's see. He said donkeys are not to be eaten because donkeys had revealed their inner selves, or in other words, inner behavior, because donkeys are willing, now look at this one, willing to male donkeys are willing to mate with other male donkeys. And he said, and that was called rijs, and that is called impurity. But here's one thing. He said, Muhammad ibn Sirin, quote, he said, there's nothing from the animals that would do the action and the behavior of Qawm Lut except pigs and donkeys, which is actually not true. There are other animals that do this, and we know seahorses, and we know monkeys, we know different animals that do this, but to necessarily use that, that's their information in regards to biology, but we can't necessarily use that as a reason. I want to say one thing, and just keep that one in mind. The understanding of science, whether we're speaking about biology or perhaps maybe other areas in chemistry or whatever it is, sometimes you can see it in the books of fiqh that was their understanding, their knowledge of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what Islam says. Just keep that one in mind. That's not necessarily what Islam says, but that's their knowledge. That was their information, their knowledge of what they had known in biology at the time. Okay. But at the same time, regardless of what they had interpreted, that, donkeys are willing to do that, etc., that let's just say we trained these donkeys not to do that. Okay, not to do this kind of behavior, or we managed to put a donkey isolated from another male donkey, and therefore I can make sure that he doesn't engage in such behavior. Does that make him halal? No, it doesn't. There's a difference between hikmah and ilm. Just keeping that one in mind. This is extremely important. So if I have a text that says this is haram, regardless of what precautions or what you manage to perhaps maybe avoid such a consequence, that does not change the reality that this is going to be haram or this is going to be wajib. Okay, there's a difference between hikmah and ilm. Let's see, number 3, he says, Amr ibn Dinar, let's see, he said, I like that he started out with this hadith in the beginning. Let's say he said Ibn Abbas had said that the people during the time of Jahiliyyah, they used to eat different things, and you used to avoid certain things. And you can see, put it between brackets, and he said taqadhura. In other words, they were disgusted of it. So they would avoid certain things. What is the reason? It was just because they were disgusted of eating it. Then the Prophet ﷺ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set him as a prophet, and of course, it was revealed in the Kitab, in the Quran, basically, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically made certain things are permissible to consume or even haram to consume. So if something is halal based on the book or Quran or based on the Sunnah, or whether it was mentioned to be in haram, then in that situation, it would be haram. But here's the word right there. وَمَا سَكَتَ عَنْهُ فَهُوَ عَفْوٌ مِنْهُ, or فَهُوَ عَفْوٌ. If the Quran or the Hadith were silent about things, then it's a dismissal from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then read, and of course, you could see that this is from Ibn Abbas. This is quoting Ibn Abbas. Who's in Ibn Abbas? Was the Prophet ﷺ's cousin, the one that the Prophet ﷺ had made the dua, Allahumma faqihhu fi ddin wa'allimhu at-ta'wil. Ya Allah, give him the understanding in deen and give him its interpretation. In other words, the tafseer, the exegesis. In other words, a deep understanding for the deen. So he explained, well, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the wahi was quiet about something, silent about something, had no mention whatsoever, then in that situation, it's dismissed and therefore basically being halal and permissible. And then he read this ayah, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. Basically the ayah that we're working it was right there in Surah Al-An'am. Okay, and he said then therefore that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not state that it was haram, and therefore it is mubah. What is mubah? Mubah means permissible. Let's see this one. And the same thing, you could see another quote of basically related to Abdullah ibn Abbas, that he basically read this one and he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid the carry-ons, basically the dead meat or deceased meat, etc., or whatever basically had died, and what إنما حرم من الميت أكلها ما يؤكل منها. And therefore, what is haram is eating dead meat or things that ما يؤكل منها. In other words, to eat anything in terms of basically consuming something as food. But as for its leather, its bones, or its fur, or its hair, then it would be halal. Okay, stop right here. If we are to say that, then based on this opinion, we could see that some scholars are, and in fact, Sahaba right there, considered that what is haram in dead animals is not necessarily everything, but what is haram is to eat it, but not benefit from it. So in other words, if we're talking about gelatin, for example, of perhaps maybe, I don't know, gelatin made of things like, let's say, dead animals, I don't know, dead cows, dead beef, or whatever it is, according to this opinion, it would be halal. Let me give you even for a mile further even. You had even some scholars say that, I mean, it's not a lot, but it's Ibn Hazm, who actually considered that what is haram in pork is not necessarily its skin or hair or bones, but its flesh. Now that one, he didn't really have any scholars endorsing that opinion, but I'm just letting you know that, you know, there's something out there. Okay, no scholar endorsed that opinion, and this is extremely important to keep in mind, because right now you're graduating, so now you know that just because a scholar said an opinion, if it's not endorsed by other scholars, that would be considered shududat. What does that mean? It's an aberration that a scholar might make. If other scholars don't endorse that opinion, that doesn't necessarily make it a valid opinion. And even because one scholar said it, yes, it's in the books of fiqh, but that's not necessarily something to adopt. Okay, let's say, so where's the evidence in regards to that? He said, well, there is another hadith that supports that opinion. And let's say, he said, عن ملقام ابن تلب عن أبيه قال صحبت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فلم أسمع لحشرة الأرض تحريما. He said, I had accompanied the Prophet ﷺ, and I did not hear that there was any حشرة الأرض, or in other words, a creature that walks on earth, that it is haram. Now, here's one thing. In the modern Arabic, حشرة الأرض is an insect. But at the time, and what this hadith is referring to as حشرة الأرض, this isn't necessarily talking about any creature. This is actually talking about صغار الدواب الأرض. This is talking about the small animals. We're not talking about big animals like elephants. No, we're talking about the smaller animals. So we're talking about things like jerboa. We're talking about lizards. We're talking about scorpion. No, al-qanafid is more porcupines. This is what we're talking about. Okay. Now here's one thing. I mean, if I'm going to look at this hadith, but I need to actually go over it and make sure that this hadith is actually authentic. So let's do that right now, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. So let's see. So what does this hadith say? فَلَمْ أَسْمَعْ لِحَشَرَةِ الْأَرْضِ تَحْرِيمًا. We're going to go over it. فَلَمْ أَسْمَعْ. And here we go. I actually Googled it before. Let's do it again. لَمْ أَسْمَعْ لِحَشَرَةِ الْأَرْضِ تَحْرِيمًا. Here we go. So beautiful thing is that they actually did, whether it's in Islam Web, and right there, I actually went right there. This is a really good website. Basically gives me the ahadith and helps me do basically a research. So let's see. He said, as regards to this hadith, it is isnaduhu da'if. Isnaduhu da'if. The chain of narration is weak. Although you could see that unfortunately when we were looking at his book and basically Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and certainly, you know, the scholars that went over this book, they didn't actually give me the hukum on this. They just said, well, this is the number of the hadith and that's basically it. But I need further investigation to see whether we're going to be basically accepting that hadith or not. And let's see further. He said, so we have a problem here in that hadith is that this Milqam ibn Talib, we don't know much about him. In fact, he is an anonymous narrator. And plus, let's see, Al-Khattabi said, well, this is not to say that this is permissible. In other words, making everything that walks and basically different creatures that are the small creatures that walk on earth, or basically, you know, that basically, you know, maybe live in burrows or anything like that, that it is necessarily permissible. He might have heard it, but not necessarily authentic. And then he goes and talks about different things. Now, I want to look at this one because, you know, you could see one very important scholar. His name is al-Khattabi. When you see that it says Abu Dawood, the second you see Abu Dawood, you're going to go and think of al-Khattabi. That's number one thing when you think about Abu Dawood. You got to think of al-Khattabi. Who's al-Khattabi? He's basically a great scholar, Shafi'i madhab, and he basically explained Sunan Abi Dawood. And let's see the quote. When you think of Abu Dawood, since this hadith is in Abu Dawood, I need to go further investigation to see what I understand from this. And here's the quote. He said, this is not necessarily an evidence to support that just because we have this quote, that it is permissible to consume. Because he might have لجواز أن يكون غيره قد سمعه وقد حضرنا فيه معنى آخر. He said because other people might have other reports to basically give more information. Just because he didn't hear about the Prophet ﷺ not saying that such and such is haram, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the final answer. In other words, what? Someone else might have more information that the Prophet ﷺ had explained that such a thing is haram, do not eat it. So just because he didn't hear it, it doesn't make it necessarily as the final ruling. And that's why he goes in details and he says, well, scholars had different opinions in regards to what is permissible. And therefore, that actually takes us to the other part of it, and which is, let's see, he said right there, we just read that right there. And he said, and people had differences of opinions on things like al-yarbu' wal-wabar. I want you to look that one up. What is al-yarbu'? Who is al-yarbu'? Let's see right there. So we need to look this guy up because, you know, let's see what al-yarbu' is. Okay, so who is our, look at him. Okay, so this is al-yarbu' right there. Look at that, look at that, just posing just beautifully for the camera right there. I know, it looks like a kangaroo that identifies as a mouse. Okay, so this is him. All right, so there you go. And let's see al-wabar. What is al-wabar? Al-wabar, okay, so this is the guy al-wabar. And okay, this is, I guess it's scientific name. Giving us right there a beautiful smile for the camera. Well, definitely telling us to stay away. So okay, let's see. And he said, in regards to those two animals, which is the Jeroboa that we saw earlier, this beautiful creature right here, and as well as this guy. And what was his name? What is that in English? Hold on, I don't even know what that is in English. Where is that? Al-Wabar. Anybody? Let's see. Al-Wabar. We're gonna go like that and actually see what that is in English. Wabar. Okay, where is that? Give me that in English. Okay, so what is that? Wabar Sakhri. Let's do it that way and see what that is in English. Let's see. Got 51 languages. Let's go to English. Orongo, Namibia. Okay, Orongo. Okay, so this is where it grows. So they didn't really have much in Saudi Arabia, but they still, yeah, I guess he just wanted to be around water, I guess. Okay. All right. Well, at least let me, in case I go on a safari, at least I'll know what to eat. Okay, let's see. So he basically said, اختلف الناس. When he says اختلف الناس, this isn't talking about people just having differences of opinions, but this is actually talking about which we're talking about scholars here and basically discussing al-yarbu. So these animals, okay, and whether they're permissible or not. Let's say, so he said, فرخص في اليربوع عروة وعطاء والشافعي وأبو ثور. اليربوع, which is our friend, where's اليربوع? This friend right here, that عروة, who's عروة? عروة is basically a tabi'i. He's the son of, the grandson of Urwa ibn Zubayr. He's the grandson. So this isn't Urwa ibn Zubayr. This is, basically the grandson of Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Okay, let's say. So Urwa and Ata. Who's Ata? Ata ibn Abi Rabah. Ata ibn Abi Rabah actually died at 110-year Hijriyah. And Ata ibn Abi Rabah was one of the main scholars, and I think we talked about him before, and we said he was a short guy, originally from a place from Africa. He had one eye, but he had a disability, even lame, bald, but he was one of the best scholars, especially in Mecca in regards to Hajj. Okay, so definitely, a great scholar, no question about that, because he was also a tabi'i. Okay, so Ata ibn Abi Rabah and al-Shafi'i and Abu Thawr, another scholar. But one thing I want to tell you is that Abu Thawr, he himself had his own madhab. He had his own school. But perhaps because he didn't have the students to record and to keep his madhab basically something that would be learned by later generations, it basically had been forgotten. But let's see. So we had great scholars and even a tabi'i right there actually say that it was permissible to eat. Al-Shafi'i said, لا بأس بالوبر. Shafi'i said, when he says la ba's, in other words, it's okay. It's okay doesn't mean it's okay that, it's okay, meaning just that he's telling you it's okay to have around. No, he's telling you it's okay, meaning to consume. Yet other scholars, كرهه ابن سيرين والحكم وحماد وأصحاب الرأي, yet other scholars, they considered it as makruh. What is makruh? Makruh is basically that something is not necessarily going to the highest level of prohibition, but a little lower, and that it is basically hated. In other words, you wouldn't be at sin for eating it, but it would be best to leave it. That's what makruh means in practice. Haram means it is not permissible to do, and you would be at sin for doing it. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, أصحاب الرأي. Who are أصحاب الرأي? Like people that just have their own opinion? No, أصحاب الرأي are basically the madhab Hanafi. So madhab Hanafi does not even regard our friend right here as necessarily haram, but regards it as makruh. I won't be having it for my maqluba for sure. Okay. Let's see. And then he goes on to say, well, the scholars of the Hanafi madhab, they also hated eating and consuming porcupines. So what does a porcupine look like? Let's get our friend right there. We get our friend porcupine. Al-Qunfud. Okay, Al-Qunfud right there. Let's see. This is him. Okay. So in other words, where do they live? Well, okay. All right, let's see. And let's see. Malik ibn Anas, he basically said, look at the adab, man. Look at the adab. He said, La adri. Said, I don't know if it's halal or not. I don't know. Look at the adab. Didn't want to say that it was halal or haram. He just said, I don't know. Abu Umar. Who's Abu Umar? Abu Umar, his other name, Ibn Abd al-Barr, famous, basically, Hafiz al-Maghrib, the main scholar in al-Maghrib. Al-Maghrib meaning we're speaking about Morocco, we're speaking about Mauritania, we're speaking about Al-Andalus. All that was considered al-Maghrib. He said, وَقَالَ مَالِكٌ لَا بَأْسَ بِأَكْلِ الْقُنْفُذ. Wait a minute, you just said that he said, La adri. Now you're saying that he said that there's nothing wrong with it? Jamil. Question that can we have scholars actually say contradictory reports? Yes. Wait a minute. So why would they say contradictory reports? I mean, they're contradicting themselves. Okay. Now, the report itself, remember, we're human. Let me tell you a story. Abu Hanifa had a very smart student. His name was Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, famously known as Abu Yusuf. Abu Yusuf, or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, he would come and his mom would send him to buy something from the market, and then Abu Yusuf would sneak to go to the lecture at Abu Hanifa's masjid and just stand at the door and just listen to the lecture. Just a young boy. Not even teenager, just a young boy. And he would just listen and listen. Mama comes in and searching for him and brings her broom. And she says, didn't I tell you to get me such and such? And then Abu Hanifa would see this every single day. And then Abu Hanifa hired a special maid for Yaqub ibn Ibrahim's mother in order to basically be the person to do the tasks that she would want Abu Yusuf to do. And that way, Abu Yusuf or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, this young boy, would attend the class and join the class. And Abu Yusuf or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim became one, if in fact, one of the most important students along with Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Now, this Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, of course, just to let you know, the class and how Abu Hanifa's classes were held was completely different than how Imam Malik's were basically conducted in. Abu Hanifa was basically teaching his students how to be engaging in class. Unlike Imam Malik, no, that was out of the question. He would basically sit on the chair, he would read the ahadith, and you had to do your duty to write it down. Questions were going to be asked at the end, and that was it. Abu Hanifa's class was completely different. Abu Hanifa would bring about a subject of, let's say, today's question is going to be, let's say, is a qunfud or is a porcupine halal to eat or not? We're going to discuss that. And then student A would talk and student B would talk and bring me the evidence. How do I challenge him with the evidence? And then they would challenge their own teacher. And then, of course, the teacher would basically challenge the students. The two students would challenge each other, etc. And it becomes more of a place of study and not necessarily a place of, let's say, just here's the information, you're going to write it down, and then the questions at the end. Completely different. Now, when you look at these things, you could see that there was a relationship, especially in Abu Hanifa's class. Abu Hanifa's class, Abu Hanifa at the end, after the discussion, then he would say, okay, let's make our final note on this matter that we just researched. And then the students would basically sit and, okay, in conclusion, this is halal, this is haram for such and such reason, and basically write it down. But there was a student that was not necessarily writing down perhaps the conclusion, but Abu Yusuf was writing everything down. So Abu Hanifa would be debating the student, would be talking to the student, would be, conducting a conversation. But Abu Yusuf was this vigilant child, was this child that was so enthusiastic, and boom, 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 he would be writing everything. Abu Hanifa saw this and he said, Yaqub, do you write everything that you're hearing me say? And he said, yes. He said, لا تفعل فإني أقول القول اليوم وأتركه غدا. I may say a matter today, and tomorrow I may discover that I was wrong on this fatwa and on that matter. So in other words, this is Abu Hanifa recognizing that there's still some update, that there could be a new research that may change my conclusion today. So recognize that research is still going to be always subject to update and development based on the resources, based on the data that we may find. Now that's a person that is not considering themselves as the center of fatwa, but considering the evidence as the center of fatwa. Now, when you look at Imam Malik, it wasn't just Abu Hanifa, but that's the same thing when you're talking about Imam Malik, that they may say a matter and then later new data, new evidence may arise, and they may basically change their fatwa based on the new information. Well, if we go to changing information or changing a madhab, you're talking about a Shafi'i who completely changed a complete madhab. He had a madhab when he was staying at Iraq, and it was called al-madhab al-qadim. And then when he went to Egypt, he had a new complete madhab, and it was called al-madhab al-jadid. When he basically meets al-Layth ibn Sa'd, he basically comes across new resources, new information, and even though he benefited so much from Imam Malik when he was younger in Medina, and then later goes to Yemen, or later goes to Baghdad, and in Baghdad, he benefits from Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. Then when he goes to Egypt, he finds new resources because you had other Sahaba that had other information that certainly they taught the other tabi'in, and the tabi'in taught the other tabi'in, and so forth. Because remember, Shafi'i died 205 Hijriya. So for sure, since he was born 150-year Hijriya, well, for sure he didn't meet any Sahabi, let alone tabi'i. But he met tabi'i, but not tabi'i himself. Okay, now you could see that there is a report of a Maliki scholar, Abu Umar or Ibn Abd al-Barr, that he said it's permissible to eat porcupines. I don't know how, if I wanted to eat this, I don't know how I would end up removing all of this, but whatever. Okay, let's see. Abu Thawr. So if you're talking about Abu Thawr, this is a key figure right there. Let's look at Abu Thawr for a bit and really see who is Abu Thawr. Now we're getting 2 times that Abu Thawr, and certainly a main scholar here that he was mentioned more than once. So let's see who Abu Thawr is. And all right, now we're going where to learn about Abu Thawr? This one. Islam Web has a very good library and really easy to get access to that library. And the easiest thing is basically going for Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. Now, this is really important to go to, because if you're going to Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, and this Siyar A'lam al-Nubala it's almost in, 25 volumes? Almost 25 volumes, at least the copy that we had in our university. Okay, let's see. Who was he? He called him Al-Imam al-Hafiz, Al-Hujjat al-Mujtahid. Oh, you can't beat that one. We said Al-Imam, meaning one of the top scholars. Al-Hafiz, he memorized a lot of different hadith, of course, Quran. Al-Hujjah, like he had a very strong argument. He was Mujtahid. He was one of the top scholars that even reached the level of Ijtihad, and he was Mufti al-Iraq. Mufti of Iraq. And what was he? His name was Aba Abdullah. Okay, so he heard basically from all these scholars, and now we know that many scholars, they called him Thiqatun Ma'mun, one of the scholars that we would trust. He was one of the great scholars, and let's say Abu Hatim, he called him كان أحد أئمة الدنيا فقها وعلما وورعا وفضلا. Wow. What did he say? He said, one of the scholars of this world, that he basically had, of course, one of the best scholars in fiqh, in knowledge, and even in wara'. Wara', it's religious integrity. Religious integrity. And there's a difference. You can be a faqih. There's a scholar, his name is Ibn al-Qassab, for example. There were reports that he didn't even pray. You know, what's really funny that there were reports on a scholar, what was his name? Oh, I can't believe I forgot his name, but even, oh, hold on. It's gonna come. I can't remember. But anyhow, but il-wara' is extremely important because there's a difference between having ilm and having wara'. Ilm is one side, but il-wara' is to really take what you had learned, in practice. And this is wara', that you don't necessarily just learn the ilm without applying it and without putting it into practice. And that's having religious integrity. That's al-wara'. And he said he had written multiple books and even supported Sunan, supported the Prophet ﷺ's hadith, and supported basically those references. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shed his mercy on him. Okay, let's say, so I'm not going to stay with talking about Abu Thawr, but at least we, since we're going to come across talking about him, I think it would be fair. كان أبو ثور لا يرى به بأسا. Abu Thawr basically thought, or basically said, that he doesn't see that there is anything wrong with it. I want to look at this one. When you say لا يرى به بأسا, or things like when we say لا بأس, right there, لا بأس actually means it's okay. Okay, but when you see here Abu Thawr لا يرى به بأسا, بأس is that there is something about it. In other words, it's either going to be makruh or it's going to be haram. But when he says لا يرى به بأسا, when it says لا يرى به بأسا, meaning that he had considered it as, well, it's okay, it's not necessarily haram. And that's the same thing that was said basically upon Shafi'i and Ibn Umar. Ibn Umar, who was that? That's Ibn Umar, that's basically Ibn Abd al-Barr. He said he basically recited قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا, coming out with the same ayah. And he said that I heard سمعت أبا هريرة. Well, not him. That I mean, there's a huge age difference. I mean, there's Abu Umar did not meet Abu Hurairah, okay, because Abu Umar died, I believe, in the 6th century or 5th century, so definitely did not get to see Abu Hurairah. Okay, فقال شيخ عنده سمعت أبا هريرة يقول ذكر عند النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال خبيثة من الخبائث. So that was mentioned in front of the Prophet ﷺ. At least Abu Hurairah had said that the porcupines were mentioned in front of the Prophet ﷺ, and he said خبيثة من الخبائث. What is a khabitha? Khabitha is something that is impure, something that is disgusting, and therefore min al-khaba'ith, and it's part of all the different things that are basically impure. And here, look at this quote. فَقَالَ ابْنُ عُمَرَ. Okay, no, I confused something. Okay, hold on. No, I confused something. Ibn Umar, not Abu Umar. Okay, Ibn Umar, that's Abdullah ibn Umar. I confused something. Okay, so Ibn Umar, فقال شيخ عنده سمعت أبا هريرة يقول فقال ابن عمر إن كان قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم هذا فهو كما قال. Something to learn. Okay, hold on. I confused all this sentence. Let me do it again. So Abdullah ibn Umar was asked in regards to this ayah. Okay, in regards to this ayah, and then he basically was was asked basically in regards to porcupines or animals, these different creatures, and an older man, an elderly, tells him that I heard Abu Huraira say that this was mentioned in front of the Prophet ﷺ, and that the Prophet ﷺ basically called it as khabithatun min al-khaba'ith. Al-khabith is anything that is not good, anything that is impure, anything that is basically not permissible. And then Ibn Umar said, if the Prophet ﷺ had said this, then it is what he had said. I want to look at this one. Abdullah ibn Umar, when he was asked about the porcupines, he just considered that I've got my reference that since there was no quote in regards to porcupines or any of these creatures, then it should be halal. But then he said, well, Abu Huraira said that it's a khabitha that the Prophet ﷺ had said. He said if he heard the Prophet ﷺ say that, then it's exactly what it is. That's it. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. So not to necessarily regard that an opinion or at least a reference is going to be whether this is a Sahabi or whether this is a scholar, their opinion is not, or their interpretation is not the reference that we would necessarily center Islam around. Islam centers around al-wahy. If there's a quote that the Prophet ﷺ had said, whether we have it in the Quran or whether we have it in a hadith, and this is authentic, خلاص. وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُنْ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِ. It does not befit for a believing man and a believing woman, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter, that they would have their own opinion beyond it. And therefore, قال مالك لا بأس بأكل الضب واليربوع والورل. And that's why Malik said there's nothing haram in eating a dab. Wait a minute, let's look at dab. What does that look like? Hold on, we're going to get that. A dab. Okay, hold on. Let's see, a dab. This is a dab. Definitely don't want it for my ma'luba. Let's see. Okay, did the Prophet ﷺ himself eat it? Well, he didn't eat it, but the Prophet ﷺ, why didn't he eat it? Well, there is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat it. He explained it that he didn't find it as something that he was accustomed to. In other words, it was not his personal preference. It was a matter of his own, not necessarily something that he would prefer to eat, but he did permit the other Sahaba that wanted to eat this to actually eat it. So what is al-yarbu'? Al-yarbu', remember our little, this is al-yarbu', Jaraboa. Okay, this is that. Okay, Malik said it's permissible. Okay, what about al-waral? What did we say al-waral was? Wait, waral. This is al-waral. Hey, the other day I actually saw something swimming next to my house like this. Look at him posing for the camera. This is al-waral, that it's permissible. Wait, let's see. Dabbatun kadab. Okay. Yeah, there was, look at him. Yeah. I don't know if you want to do it, but okay, let's see. And he said, وَجَائِزٌ عَنْدَهُ أَكْلُ الْحَيَّاتِ إِذَا ذُكِّيَتْ. Like for Imam Malik, that it's permissible to eat snakes if they were dhukiyat, if they were slaughtered, basically from the throat and up. Wait a minute. So if we're talking about, maybe we should do snake anatomy. Anatomy. Where's the neck? Here's the heart. Trachea. Okay. So how do I slaughter it? I mean, it's not like I'm going to be having it for my ma'lube, but I don't know. Okay, whatever. So the whole thing is actually there. That's the stomach. If you kill it from here, do you actually kill it? Okay, anyhow. So now you say it. So he basically said if it was slaughtered, that it would be permissible. And this is the opinion of Ibn Abi Layla wal-Awza'i. Ibn Abi Layla wal-Awza'i. So it's halal to eat this animal. Snakes don't have necks. Well, exactly. Well, I mean, yeah. at the end of the day, this is the opinion of Imam Malik and Ibn Abi Layla and al-Awza'i. Al-Awza'i is a scholar from Lebanon. What about Ibn Abi Layla? Who's that? Let's look into Ibn Abi Layla, right? Let's look into Ibn Abi Layla, because I want you to know who these scholars are. You can see I was looking into him before, and let's see really quick about Ibn Abi Layla before we basically just quote off Ibn Abi Layla. Let's see, right there. He said, Ibn Abi Layla, al-Allama, al-Imam, Mufti al-Kufa wa qadiha. So he's basically Allama, a great scholar, and basically Mufti al-Kufa. And the Mufti for al-Kufa, where's al-Kufa? Kufa is in Iraq. And he's also the grand judge. His name is Abu Abdurrahman al-Ansari. Okay, let's say. And let's see right there. كان يحفظ كتاب الله. Basically memorize the Quran. And let's say he said وكان نظيرا للإمام أبي حنيفة في الفقه. He was as a great scholar, in other words, very similar, in fact, at the same level of Abu Hanifa in fiqh. That's how of a great scholar he is. But I want you to look at this comment right here. In Imam Ahmad, he said, Yahya ibn Sa'id, who was a great scholar in hadith, he used to consider Ibn Abi Layla da'if. Da'if doesn't mean skinny, but da'if meaning I wouldn't consider his narrations as necessarily the top narrations, but they may contain at least poor memorization. That's why Imam Ahmad, let's look at this one. He said, كان سيء الحفظ مضطرب الحديث وكان فقهه أحب إلينا من حديث. He said, كان سيء الحفظ. His memorization was not good. مضطرب الحديث. His hadith, in other words, we're talking about hadith containing some conflicts or discrepancies, but he said, but his fiqh is better than his hadith narrations. Okay, let's say. And وقال أيضا هو في عطاء أكثر خطأ. Okay, all right. So at least we know just a little bit. Okay, wanted to go back to it. Let's see right there. And he said, and this is, so what are we talking about? We're talking about eating snakes. That it is also the word, what was narrated, or at least what the fatwa that Ibn Abi Layla had said in al-Awza'i, and eating snakes, eating scorpions, and eating mice. Al-Adhaya. What is that? What is al-Adhaya? What are al-Adhaya? Al-Adhaya, you know, it basically is Sahliya. You know what that is? Should we look into that one? Sahliya, you know what Sahliya means? Sahliya basically is, hold on. What are we going to, okay, here we go. We're going to get into looking at a Sahliya. What is a Sahliya? Let's see right there. Al-Adhaya. Al-Adhaya. These are it. This is it. So they considered that this is permissible. Where is it? These things. Okay. Now we know. So they're basically, what do we call these? I mean, we call them Sahliya in Palestine, but I know my brother used to love carrying those, and he would basically just take them as the pets. Okay, so this is al-Adhaya, whatever it's called in English. Okay, now you know. So let's say, and then what? And basically, al-Qunfudh, and even porcupines, and even frogs. So for those that Chinese converts, if you know, now you know that there are some scholars that actually consider things like scorpions, mice, lizards, porcupines, and frogs to be in halal. Let's see, Ibn al-Qasim, who's also Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim, one of the great Maliki scholars, and he says it is permissible to eat from basically these animals that live on basically the burrows on earth, and even the scorpions, and even dudiha, the different dud are basically worms, according to Imam Malik. And the reason for that, he said, well, if these worms were in water and they died in water, then in that situation, that doesn't make this water as necessarily impure, then therefore, why should they be considered as impure? And Malik said, you are permitted to eat also the baby bees, or even the parasites or worms in cheese, or even the worms in dates and so forth. So, let me give you an example. If you were to look at figs, inside figs, expect to have worms. In fact, you cannot, there are certain figs, you cannot eat it without a worm. Certain figs, in order for them to pollinate, to basically be a fig, there has to be a worm in it. The worm basically makes the pollination and basically make it. My grandfather used to eat it and used to say dudu min udu, that the worms in it is basically part of its nature. I don't know why, but I guess, in his simple description, that's what he used to say. But here you could see Imam Malik considered that it is permissible to eat these worms, even if you find them in dates, or perhaps maybe in cheese, or even in honey, in basically looking at the parasites. Well, I mean, you're talking about bees right there. Okay. And what is the evidence? They said, well, hadith Milqam ibn Talib. Their evidence is basically this hadith. Which hadith? It's basically the hadith that we talked about earlier. I think we talked about hadith al-Milqam ibn Talib before, and we said, what did we say right there? We said this hadith. This is the hadith al-Milqam ibn Talib. But guess what? There's actually isnaduhu da'if. What does that mean? That means they don't really have an evidence to prove that eating snakes, scorpions, lizards, mice, frogs, porcupines, or even these things is necessarily halal. And Ibn Abbas said, Ma halallah fahuwa halal. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded it as halal, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded it as haram, then it's haram. And let's say Sayyida Aisha even goes farther and says, mice are halal to eat. And then she used the evidence, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. And let's go further. And some of the scholars in Medina, they said, well, we don't permit eating any of that, such as snakes or even lizards or mice or anything of that sort. The only thing that you could do, well, وَكُلُّ مَا يَجُوزُ قَتْلُهُ. And anything that you are permitted to kill, then you're not permitted to eat it. Because anyways, you cannot slaughter it. Just like, I believe someone in the chat basically said, well, you can't really slaughter the snake, which is exactly what the scholars of Medina said. They said, you can't even slaughter that. So there's no way that you could do that. And that's basically the quotation of Ibn Shihab, Urwa, Shafi'i, and Abu Hanifa. They all said the same thing. And let's see, there's another opinion for Imam Malik that siba'ul wahshi, hold on, ولا يؤكل عند مالك وأصحابه شيء من سباع الوحش كلها ولا الهر الأهلي ولا الوحشي لأنه سبع. قال ولا يؤكل الضبع ولا الثعلب ولا بأس بأكل سباع الطيور. Okay. According to Imam Malik and his friends, basically the Malikiyya, it is not permissible to eat anything from siba'ul wahshi kullina. What is siba'ul wahsh? Siba'ul wahsh, basically the carnivore animals, not necessarily domestic cats or even wild cats, because they're all considered as sab'a. So why do we bring this up anyways? Why sab'a? Because remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered anything that is a sab'a, anything that basically preys on other animals. If it preys on other animals, then that's a sab'a. A sab'a is anything that preys on other animals. In other words, it's a carnivore. Okay, and therefore, eating hyenas, eating foxes is basically not permissible. And therefore, with the same, anything that eats another animal, but basically considered that, well, in terms of birds, that it's permissible to eat the animals that eat and feed on other animals. And so this is really strange. Look at this one. So he basically said al-rakham. Let's look at al-rakham. What is al-rakham? Al-rakham is basically the Egyptian vulture. Let's look at it. I'm going to write al-rakham for you to see what that looks like. Okay? I mean, definitely not my mulukhiyah favorite, but this is a rakham. Okay? And eagles, we know eagles. Let's look at eagles really quick. Okay? In Nusur, right there. This is a Nisr. Man, this guy looks powerful, doesn't he? Yep. That bald eagle right there, beautiful. Okay, let's see. Al-Iqab. Let's see. Al-Uqab, actually. It's Uqab. Right there, this is Al-Uqab, a hawk. Man, those birds, wallahi al-azim, just look at their eyes. And you could see, this is strong, man. You could see that this guy is not a guy that you would joke with. Okay, let's see. And anything that would eat, basically carrion. So, let's see, let's do it again. What did they say? Hold on, let's do it again. ولا بأس بأكل سباع الطير كلها الرخم والنسور والعقبان وغيرها ما أكل الجيف منها وما لم يأكل. So basically all the animals that, all the birds that, even the birds that feed on carrion, so basically deceased animals, whether they feed on it or not. And in fact, you see Awza'i, a scholar from Lebanon, he said all birds are halal, but they used to hate al-rakham, the vultures. And the evidence that Malik had used is وأنه لم يجد أحدا من أهل العلم يكره أكل سباع الطير. What's the evidence that Malik used? He said, well, we didn't see any scholars say that eating these the carnivore birds, and therefore the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had forbid eating from every single bird that basically has claws from birds, that the Prophet ﷺ forbid it. Let's see. And it was narrated upon Ashhab that it is permissible to eat elephants if it was slaughtered. And it was the words of a Sha'bi, and the Shafi'i had regarded it as haram. It's quite interesting, right? Here's what we're going to do. I'm just, laying out. That doesn't mean, okay, I don't want you going, tomorrow and saying, okay, I always wanted to get, a scorpion biryani or anything of that. So we're just going to stop right there, okay? And we're going to continue. I'm just laying out the opinion. So we still didn't get to the other part of our class, which is, so what is right there the preponderant ruling? So please, do not make your biryani on elephant meat yet till we get to speaking about the different evidences in that regards and coming to the final opinion. I'm just wondering, if I were to say, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT, the cost of 1 kilo of elephant meat. Not that I'm going to buy it. I'm just asking, okay? It's illegal to buy or sell. But it would cost 40, hold on. When traded legally, the cost of a live elephant can range from 40,000 to over 200,000. So the ivory says 500, 1,500 per kilogram. Okay, so you know what? Let's see. Cost of lion meat. 1 kilo. Okay, just messing around right there. Not legally sold. Okay. But in some areas in licensed meat farms in South Africa can be sold legally $200 to $1,000 per kilogram. Man, that's so expensive. Okay, now that don't buy it yet. Okay, we're gonna do some research. Okay, don't buy any of that. Astaghfirullah. All right, I'm just right there. Just laying out the different scholars' opinions and basically, all right. All right, I'm just laying out the differences of opinions. I'm just letting you see this. We didn't get to completing all of this. You could see right there. I actually was hoping to finish all of this today, but I think yeah, it's going to take us, inshallah, some time. So if there are any questions, go ahead before we end. Any questions? Any dreams to probably one day, I guess, try anything out? Maybe anybody wants to share anything? Or maybe write it in the chat. Tell me I've always wanted to try maybe, I don't know, frog soup or anything of that kind. I know nothing of that interests me whatsoever, but I know I had some Chinese people that converted to Islam, and they were so sad that eating frogs was not halal. So yeah,